He returned to the Alabama town that once called his father a traitor, only to inherit a silent field of 412 white crosses. But when his dog started digging beneath one, he found a military tag with his own name on it. That's when he realized this wasn't just land. It was a cover-up buried in red clay, hiding the truth about who was allowed to be called a hero. The road back to red clay stretched like a faded scar through the Alabama countryside, lined with rusted mailboxes and the scent of wild magnolias turning sweet in the November air. Caleb Mercer drove in silence, the hum of his old truck blending with the steady breath of his dog, Ranger, resting in the passenger seat. The veteran's hands were callous, his eyes hollowed by years of service that had taken more than they ever gave. On the seat beside him sat a letter from a lawyer. A stranger had left him land in red clay. The words, "Field of Crosses," had echoed in his mind since the day he opened that envelope, a name too haunting and sacred to ignore. He hadn't been back since he was 8, back when the townspeople spat on his father's boots and whispered the word half-blood under their breath. His father, Henry Mercer, had left red clay to fight a war that wasn't his, only to come back in a coffin sealed by a government that never explained why. Caleb's mother had packed their belongings overnight and fled north, swearing they'd never look back. But life had a cruel way of circling back to its origins, and here he was, a veteran like his father, driving back to a town that once erased their name. The truck rattled as he crossed the wooden bridge into town. Faded murals of soldiers and flags clung to brick walls, chipped and forgotten. A group of old men outside the diner paused mid-conversation, their eyes narrowing when they recognized the Mercer name on his license plate. Caleb didn't stop. He had learned long ago that silence was safer than confrontation. Ranger, sensing the tension, lifted his head, his golden fur shimmering under the weak sun. The dog was a rescue, much like Caleb himself, loyal to a fault, steady through the ghosts that haunted them both. The road turned to dirt as he approached the edge of town. The land opened up before him, vast and lonely, surrounded by wild grass that swayed like whispers in the wind. The wooden gate was crooked, but still standing, and a rusted sign leaned against it, faintly etched with the words Mercer Property. Caleb stepped out, the red clay crunching beneath his boots, and gazed upon what he'd inherited. 412 white crosses, perfectly aligned in rows, stretching to the horizon. Each one stood weathered, nameless, and eerily quiet. He walked slowly among them, feeling the weight of every step. The crosses looked too precise to be random, each planted with purpose. He noticed some tilted slightly forward, as if bowed under invisible grief. The soil smelled of iron and age. Caleb couldn't tell whether this was a burial ground or a memorial. The letter from the lawyer hadn't said. It had only included a single line handwritten at the bottom. He wanted you to have it. He said you'd understand. But Caleb didn't understand. Not yet. As the sun began to sink behind the hills, memories came like unwelcome ghosts. He saw flashes of his father's back, bent under the weight of a duffel bag, the way his mother's trembling hand had clutched his when soldiers came to the door. He remembered the white man who called his father boy in front of the whole town, the shame that turned to fire in his father's eyes. That memory had never left him. It was the same fire that had burned through every battlefield he'd survived, the fire of wanting to belong somewhere, anywhere. He spent the afternoon exploring the land, finding an old shack near the edge of the field. Inside were remnants of time long forgotten, a cracked lantern, a folded flag, and a journal so faded its pages crumbled at the touch. He placed it gently back, his heart heavy with questions. Ranger trotted through the field, sniffing at the base of the crosses, occasionally glancing back, as if sensing something Caleb couldn't yet see. By evening, the wind turned colder, carrying the faint scent of rain. Caleb sat on the porch steps of the shack, staring at the endless rows of white. Each cross seemed to tell a silent story, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the land was watching him. He thought of his father, of all the men who had gone to war and returned nameless, their stories buried deeper than the graves that held them. He wondered who had built this place, who had counted the crosses, and why him. The night crept in slowly, painting the sky in shades of ash and violet. Ranger circled near a patch of earth that seemed slightly disturbed, pawing at the ground with focused intent. Caleb called to him softly, but the dog didn't listen. Instead, Ranger began to dig, his paws tossing red dirt aside with quiet urgency. Caleb approached, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The beam caught a glint beneath the soil, something metallic. He crouched down, brushing away the dirt until a small, tarnished object emerged, a military tag. He turned it over in his palm, his breath catching as the letters came into focus under the flickering light. The earth fell silent around him. Ranger stood still, ears perked, watching. Caleb felt his pulse thud against his ribs, the chill of realization crawling up his spine. The tag was old, too old to be his, yet there it was, carrying his name, buried beneath a cross on land he didn't remember, in a town that had never wanted him. The wind howled softly through the field, rustling the crosses like a chorus of restless souls. Caleb stared into the dark, his reflection shimmering faintly in the metal tag. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he had returned home. He felt like he had stepped into someone else's unfinished story, one that carried his name long before he arrived. And somewhere in the stillness of red clay, the land seemed to breathe. By morning, word had already spread across red clay like wildfire. The Mercer boy was back, and he'd inherited the field. The same field the town called sacred, where the descendants of old war heroes claimed their dead lay sleeping. Caleb could feel the eyes on him before he even saw the faces. Curtains shifted, conversations hushed when his truck rolled through Main Street. The old diner clock still ticked over the doorway, the same one his father used to glance at while waiting for coffee. He was never truly welcome to drink. The air was thicker now, as if time itself refused to move forward. He stopped outside the feed store to buy supplies. The man behind the counter, with a face aged by sun and suspicion, handed him a bag of nails without a word. Caleb nodded, placing the bills on the counter, and walked out with his shoulders squared against the silence. Every corner of red clay carried the weight of what had been forgotten or deliberately buried. He had thought time might have changed people, softened their edges, but the looks told him otherwise. To them, he was still Henry Mercer's boy, the mixed son who didn't belong to one world or the other. As he drove back toward the field, the sign on the sheriff's office caught his eye. Harlan Pike, sheriff. The name stirred a dull ache in his memory. Pike, the same family that had led the charge against his father decades ago. The same lineage that had whispered through the town's history, like smoke through broken windows. When Caleb reached the field gate, a sheriff's cruiser was already parked there, dust clinging to its sides like memory refusing to settle. Sheriff Harlan Pike stepped out, broad-shouldered and deliberate in his movements. His face carried the kind of stillness that came from years of command, but his eyes, pale gray and distant, told a story of knowing more than he'd ever admit. "I heard you came back," Pike said after a pause that lingered too long. "Didn't expect you'd want anything from this place." Caleb studied him, seeing in the sheriff's features a faint resemblance to the man from his father's faded photographs. Maybe it was just the name. Maybe it was something deeper. He replied calmly, "I didn't ask for it. Someone thought I should have it." The sheriff's gaze drifted toward the crosses, his expression unreadable. "That field's been quiet a long time. Best keep it that way." There was no overt threat, just a warning carried in the air like a cold draft. Caleb didn't answer. Ranger barked once from the porch, the sound sharp and clear. The sheriff nodded slowly, tipped his hat, and drove away, his tires stirring red dust into the wind. After the car disappeared down the road, Caleb stood in the stillness, trying to shake the unease. Ranger trotted toward one of the crosses, the same one he had dug beside last night. The dog circled it again, whined softly, then sat, tail curled tight. Caleb approached and knelt by the disturbed earth, running his fingers through the soil. The metal tag he had found still weighed heavy in his pocket. It didn't make sense, but something about this land pulsed with unfinished memory. He spent the afternoon exploring the farmhouse again, this time with more intent. Dust coated everything, but beneath it were traces of someone who had lived with care. Boots lined neatly by the door, a stack of folded letters tied with fraying string, an old Bible resting open on the table to the Book of John. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye near the window ledge, A wooden box carved with military insignia, its hinges stiff with rust. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a small leather-bound journal. The name etched faintly inside the cover made his pulse tighten. Thomas "Tommy" Pike. The surname struck him harder than he expected. Pike, the sheriff's family. He opened the first few pages. The handwriting slanted but strong, filled with entries that spoke of fear, loyalty, and confusion. During the Vietnam War, Tommy wrote about his unit, men who fought side by side, yet divided by color when the bullets stopped flying. He spoke of a man named Henry Mercer, Caleb's father, the only soldier who had saved him twice, yet whose name the Army refused to acknowledge in their final records. As the afternoon light faded through cracked glass, Caleb sat by the window, reading until the words began to blur. Each sentence carried the rhythm of a man haunted by guilt. The last entry stopped mid-thought, the ink trailing off like a breath cut short. He turned one more page, and there it was, a single line, written differently, shakier, as though in haste. "He died under my name to save me." Caleb froze. His mind reeled back to the sheriff's warning, to the field of crosses that had no names. The realization pressed down like a weight he couldn't move. His father's story, the man the town had hated, the soldier history had erased, was entangled with the very family that had buried the truth. Outside, Ranger barked again, his voice echoing through the open fields. Caleb looked up, heart pounding, as the wind swept through the rows of crosses, making them sway like silent witnesses to a shared sin. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky bruised in crimson light. The town might have forgotten his father, but the land had not. Somewhere out there, beneath one of those crosses, was the truth of who died for whom, and why the past refused to stay buried. The next morning broke under a pale sun. Its light strained through low clouds that hung heavy over the field. Caleb barely slept. The journal's words had carved themselves into his mind. He died under my name to save me. Every breath he took carried the question that sentence left behind. If his father had died under another man's name, then whose name had been carved into those crosses? Whose death had history chosen to remember, and whose had it chosen to erase? Determined to find the truth, Caleb drove into town. The library sat at the end of Main Street, its old brick walls wrapped in ivy and silence. Inside, the air smelled of dust and fading paper. The librarian, an elderly woman with a gaze that flickered between recognition and unease, hesitated before helping him. When Caleb mentioned his father's name, she lowered her voice as if speaking it might summon unwanted ghosts. Still, she pointed him toward the military records in the basement archives. The room was cold, lit by the flicker of fluorescent bulbs. Rows of metal cabinets stood like sentinels guarding the past. Caleb worked through stacks of records, the rhythmic sound of paper sliding from folders echoing softly against the concrete walls. Hours passed before he found it. A service file marked Henry Caleb Mercer, Vietnam, 1975. He pulled it open with care. Inside lay a photograph of his father in uniform, eyes bright with the defiant hope of youth. But beneath the picture, stamped in red ink, were the words that made Caleb's stomach tighten. Deceased, Kiaya. His father's official death date, April 17, 1975. The same day, Caleb realized that Thomas "Tommy" Pike's journal had abruptly ended. He turned the page. Attached were newspaper clippings and a telegram addressed to the Pike family. Condolences for the death of their son, Sergeant Thomas Pike, who gave his life for his country. Yet the service number printed on the document matched Henry Mercer's records. The names were switched. The government had buried his father under another man's identity. The town, it seemed, had gone along with the lie, preserving the Pike family's pride while silencing the Mercer name once and for all. Caleb sat in the quiet basement, his pulse echoing in his ears. His father had died twice, once in a war he survived, and again in a lie that erased him. When he stepped out into the daylight, the streets of red clay looked different. Every storefront, every cracked sidewalk seemed complicit. The people walking past carried the same inherited silence their parents had kept. Caleb climbed into his truck and drove back to the field, the weight of betrayal heavy on his chest. Ranger barked from a distance as he pulled in, tail flicking anxiously. The dog's fur was streaked with dirt. He had been digging again. Caleb followed him to the spot beside the same cross that had revealed the first tag. The ground was freshly disturbed. Kneeling, Caleb brushed the soil aside until his fingers touched something hard. He dug with his hands until the shape of another metal tag appeared, rusted and pitted by years underground. When he wiped the dirt away, the name caught in the sunlight. Thomas Pike. Caleb froze, staring at it. The name from the journal. The same man whose record his father's had been switched with. It wasn't coincidence. This land, this field, it was a ledger written in graves. Ranger sat quietly beside him, ears down, watching as though he understood the gravity of what they had found. Inside the farmhouse, Caleb spread the 2 tags across the table, his father's and Pike's. He looked from one to the other, trying to understand the connection. Why would a man like Thomas Pike, a white soldier, exchange identities with Henry Mercer, a black one? The answer had to lie somewhere between guilt and loyalty, the kind of debt that outlives men. As the afternoon deepened, Caleb drove toward the sheriff's office. The need for truth outweighed the fear that had shadowed him since arriving. Sheriff Harlan Pike was standing outside, speaking to a deputy when Caleb approached. The sheriff's eyes tightened when he saw the dog tags in Caleb's hand. "I found something in that field," Caleb said quietly. "Something that shouldn't exist." Pike's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped low, deliberate. "You're stirring ghosts, Mercer. Some histories are better left buried." Caleb met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "My father's not a ghost. He's a man who was erased." The sheriff's jaw clenched. "You don't understand what that field is," he said after a long silence. "What it cost to keep peace in this town after that war." His voice wavered at the edges, betraying something beneath the authority. Fear, perhaps, or shame. Before Caleb could press further, the sheriff turned away. "Go home," he muttered, "before you bring down more than you can handle." Caleb drove back through the darkening roads, unease thickening like the storm clouds building over the hills. Ranger paced restlessly when they returned to the field, barking toward the far edge where the wind hissed through the grass. The dog's instincts were rarely wrong. Caleb followed, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dusk. Then he saw it, a faint glow at the edge of the field, small at first, then growing. Smoke. Someone had set fire to one of the crosses. The dry wood crackled, flames licking upward with greedy hunger. Caleb ran closer, his throat tightening at the sight. The burning cross stood against the sky, like a cruel reminder of every prejudice that had built this land. He reached for a bucket near the shack, trying to douse it, but the fire spread faster than he could move. Ranger barked wildly, circling him, the air thick with smoke and heat. When the wind shifted, Caleb caught sight of a shadowed figure near the tree line, tall, unmoving, watching. The silhouette turned slowly and disappeared into the dark before Caleb could call out. He stood still, chest heaving, watching the flames consume what little truth remained visible. The crosses crackled in the silence. There, glow reflecting in his eyes like the ghosts of everything red clay had buried. Somewhere beyond the smoke, the sheriff's warning replayed in his mind. Some history should stay buried. But Caleb knew now that the truth wasn't buried. It was burning to be seen. The night raged with the hiss of burning wood and the thick scent of smoke clawing at the air. The fire had swallowed the first row of crosses before Caleb could reach them. Flames danced wild across the red earth, the white paint of the wooden markers turning to black streaks of ash. The field, once silent and reverent, now glowed like a battlefield, resurrected. Caleb ran toward the blaze, the heat pressing against his face, his breath coming short and sharp. There was no one else in sight, no helping hands, no fire trucks, just him, his dog, and the ghosts of names long forgotten. He grabbed an old tin bucket by the shack, filled it from the water trough, and hurled it onto the flame. The sound of water hissing against heat filled the night, but the fire refused to die. Caleb kept going, again and again, until his arms burned and his throat ached from the smoke. Ranger stayed close, barking hoarsely, limping through the dirt as if his loyalty was stronger than pain. Together, they fought to reclaim what little was left of the field's dignity. When the final embers began to dim, the land fell eerily quiet again. A thin layer of smoke hung low, drifting across the ruined crosses like fog from another world. Caleb dropped to his knees, exhausted, the bucket slipping from his grasp. His shirt was soaked through, his skin streaked with soot. He stared at what remained, a jagged stretch of blackened wood, charred ground, and glinting metal half buried in the ashes. The glint caught his eye first. He crawled closer, brushing away the ash with his hands. Beneath the scorched surface, small metal tags lay scattered like fallen coins. One after another, he uncovered them, 17 in total. Each tag bore a name. Each name was one he'd never seen in any official record. They weren't soldiers the country had remembered. They were the ones it had chosen to forget. He lined the tags carefully on a plank of wood, his trembling fingers tracing the etched letters. The names told a story written outside history books. Black soldiers who had fought, died, and vanished from recognition. Caleb's breath hitched as he realized what the fire had revealed. The blaze hadn't been meant to destroy. It had uncovered the truth buried beneath. He lifted his gaze to the horizon, where the dark sky pressed against the last fading glow of flames. The air smelled of rain and loss. His father's name echoed through his thoughts, tangled with the others. All those men, erased by the same lie that had buried Henry Mercer under another man's legacy. Caleb understood now. This land wasn't just a resting place. It was evidence. A secret cemetery built to hide the shame of an army that couldn't bear the equality of its own soldiers. Ranger whimpered beside him, his breathing shallow, his fur singed at the edges. Caleb knelt and ran his hand along the dog's neck, the roughness of Ranger's coat grounding him back into the moment. The animal's loyalty pierced him deeper than any wound could. While the world had turned its back, Ranger had stayed. Through the smoke and fire, through confusion and grief, the dog never left his side. The night stretched long and cold. Caleb sat among the ruins, his head bowed. Memories of his father flooded back. The laughter that filled their small kitchen, the firm hand on his shoulder before deployment, the promise that, someday, you'll understand why I fought. Tears came, unbidden and raw, cutting through the dirt on his face. He wasn't crying only for his father anymore, but for every man who had been buried nameless under false glory. He rose slowly, walking among the burned crosses. Many were nothing but stumps now, leaning in surrender. He ran his hand across one, feeling the brittle texture of the wood crumble beneath his fingers. A sense of finality clung to the air. Yet beneath that destruction, a strange calm took root. The fire had taken, but it had also given, truth. As he sifted through the ashes near the original grave where Ranger had first dug, something caught his attention. A corner of paper, blackened but intact, peeked from the soil. Carefully, he lifted it out. The edges were curled and brittle, but the ink still held its form. It looked like a letter, burned but stubbornly preserved. He brushed the soot away until the first line came into view, scrawled in a shaky but deliberate hand. To whoever finds this, tell my son I am not dead. Caleb froze. The world seemed to stop breathing. The fire's faint crackle faded into silence. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. The handwriting was unmistakable. He had seen it before, on the old family Bible, in letters his father had written home from overseas. It was Henry Mercer's. His hand shook as he held the fragile paper closer to the light of the dying embers. The rest of the words were smudged, unreadable. But that one line was enough to split his soul in two. His father's truth, buried for decades, was clawing its way out of the soil, just as the dog tags had. Ranger pressed against him, sensing the tremor in his voice, as Caleb whispered to the night, "You're still here, aren't you?" The wind stirred, carrying ash through the air like drifting snow. Somewhere beyond the field, a lone owl called, its cry hollow and distant. The night held its breath, as if waiting for him to act. The meaning behind the letter struck like lightning. His father hadn't died in 1975, not in the way they said. The lie had been built to cover something deeper, something the town had helped bury under years of silence. Maybe Henry Mercer had survived under another identity. Or maybe his death had been rewritten to protect a truth the military couldn't face. Either way, the story was no longer about loss. It was about erasure. Caleb folded the letter gently and slipped it into his jacket. He looked over the field, smoke still rising, the air thick with ghosts and secrets. Ranger limped closer, leaning against his leg for warmth. The dog's eyes met his, steady and knowing, as if urging him not to stop here. Caleb's grief hardened into resolve. This land had taken enough from his family. It was time to uncover everything it had hidden. The sky darkened further, thunder rumbling in the distance. The first drops of rain began to fall, sizzling softly as they hit the smoldering ground. Caleb stood there, soaked in memory and purpose, the burned letter safe against his chest. Each raindrop hissed as it struck the ashes, like the land itself was cleansing its own guilt. But as the rain thickened and the wind picked up, a single thought refused to leave his mind. If the letter was true, then someone else had known. Someone had buried his father's truth beneath lies and fire, and that someone might still be watching. The rain had slowed to a mist by the time Caleb sat inside the farmhouse, lantern light trembling against the old wooden walls. His clothes were still damp from the night's struggle, but it was not the cold that made his hands shake. It was the letter, half burnt, half saved, the last voice of a man the world claimed had died in 1975. The edges were blackened, the center preserved like something the earth itself had refused to let die. He laid it gently on the table, smoothed the brittle paper, and began to read his father's words, as though he were opening a door to the past. "Caleb," it began, the ink thin but steady, "if you are reading this, it means the lies didn't stay buried." His throat tightened. No date, no formal greeting, just a father speaking to a son across decades of silence. The next lines cut deeper. Henry Mercer wrote of a day in Vietnam when command had called him in and told him the unit was in chaos. A white sergeant, Thomas Pike, had been listed as killed in action, but his body had never been recovered. Racial tensions were high. The unit divided. The officers panicked. So they made a decision that should never have been made. They ordered Henry, a black soldier, to take the dead man's identity so that the official story stayed clean. They said it was for unity, the letter read. But unity built on a lie is just another name for control. Caleb closed his eyes for a moment, letting the truth settle. His father hadn't just disappeared. He had been forced to vanish, ordered to wear another man's death so the army could keep its numbers straight and its white families comforted. Henry had agreed, not because he accepted the injustice, but because he believed it would protect his brothers in arms. The letter spoke of loyalty, of how Pike had once pulled Henry from an ambush, of how Henry had sworn he would return that favor if the chance ever came. "I owed him my life," Henry wrote, "but I did not owe the world my name." Then a line appeared that tied everything together. "Pike will protect the field." Caleb read it twice. His father had not been speaking of the sheriff now in town, but of his father, the original Thomas "Tommy" Pike, the man whose journal Caleb had found. The two men, black and white, had fought the same war and made a pact the world would never understand. They knew some soldiers would never be properly recorded. They knew some men, especially black men, would be erased from the honor rolls, their bravery lost in clerical decisions and racial discomfort. So they built a place for them, not on official ground, but on red Alabama soil, a field of crosses, outside federal notice, outside military cemeteries, a sanctuary for the forgotten. Caleb felt the realization settle like a weight and a blessing. The field was not random. It was intentional. It was the answer to why so many unnamed markers existed. His father and Pike had agreed to hide the erased soldiers here, to keep their memories alive when Washington refused to. That was why the sheriff had come with warnings instead of support. He was guarding a promise his father had made. He was not just defending land. He was defending a deal built on guilt, loyalty, and fear of exposure. The letter grew more personal near the bottom, the handwriting wavering. Henry wrote of regret, not for taking the false death, but for what it had cost his family. "I knew they would tell your mother I was gone," he wrote. "I knew you would grow up thinking I died that day. I wanted to come back under my own name, but too many people stood to lose too much." In those lines, Caleb heard the quiet grief of a man who had been asked to disappear for the sake of white reputations. "If the field is still there," the letter continued, "then they kept their word. But I want more than being kept in secret. I want you to know me." Caleb's eyes burned. All the years of feeling unmoored, of not knowing why his father's story never fit, came crashing together. This was not just abandonment. It was sacrifice, a sacrifice that served everyone but the family left behind. He stared through the window toward the crosses, some still smoldering, and something hardened in him. This field had been built in silence. He would not let it stay silent. He rose from the table, the letter folded carefully and placed over his heart. "I'll finish it, Dad," he whispered to the empty room. "I'll put their names back." His vow was not dramatic, not shouted. It was steady, forged from the quiet rage of a man who had seen too much injustice to let another one stand. He would restore every name. He would find every tag buried under this soil. He would make the town speak the truths it had swallowed. Night had deepened, but his resolve carried him back outside. Ranger followed, still limping but unwilling to stay behind. Caleb walked straight to the cross where Ranger had first dug, the one that bore no name but seemed to pull at him like a thread. If the letter was real, if his father had truly been buried without recognition, then this was where the truth would be. He grabbed a shovel from the side of the shack and began to dig. The soil was damp from rain, heavy and red, clinging to the metal. Each thrust into the earth felt like breaking through years of silence. He dug past roots, past the layer of ash from the fire, past the soft earth that had held its secret without protest. Ranger stood above him, watching, tail low, as if guarding sacred ground. The shovel struck something solid. Caleb slowed, then dropped to his knees, pushing dirt aside with his hands. The shape emerged, not wood, not stone, but bone wrapped in remnants of fabric. His breath caught. This was no symbolic grave. This was a real one. He cleared the chest area and found what he had been searching for. A dog tag, still hanging where it had been placed decades ago. He lifted it gently, wiping the dirt away with his thumb. The name appeared beneath the grime. Letters worn, but undeniable. Mercer, Sr. The world narrowed to the space between his hands and the tag. The field, the town, the years, the cover-up, all of it converged here, in the red clay of a town that had pretended his father never existed. Now the truth lay in front of him, undeniable and unburned. The shovel slipped from Caleb's trembling hands as the weight of what lay before him settled like iron across his chest. The earth had given up its secret. The bones, weathered and pale, against the red soil, were all that remained of the man he had been searching for, his father, Henry Mercer. Time had stripped everything but the truth, and it now stared back at him with a silence that felt both sacred and unbearable. The dog tag, still resting in his palm, glimmered faintly under the weak light of dawn. Mercer Sr. It wasn't a coincidence, nor was it a mistake. This was his father's resting place, buried beneath a false name, hidden in a field built on lies. Caleb sank to his knees beside the open grave, his breath shuddering through the still air. The damp soil clung to his pants, streaking them with the same clay that had swallowed his family story decades ago. The world seemed to blur at the edges, as if even the air couldn't bear witness to his grief. He reached out, his fingers brushing the remnants of a jacket, the faded cloth still clinging to fragments of buttons and thread. He imagined his father once wearing it, alive, strong, walking through the same red earth as he did now. The ache in his chest deepened until it felt like something might tear loose. Ranger, exhausted from the night's ordeal, lowered himself beside the grave. The dog didn't bark or whine. He simply lay there, head resting on his paws, eyes locked on the bones. It was as though he understood the gravity of the moment, the sacredness of what had been found. His loyalty had led them to this truth, step by step, dig by dig. Caleb reached out and rested his hand on Ranger's back, drawing comfort from the steady rhythm of his breathing. It was the kind of loyalty words could never describe, quiet, enduring, unconditional. As the first rays of light stretched over the horizon, the crunch of tires on gravel broke the silence. Caleb turned. The sheriff's cruiser rolled to a stop near the gate, dust curling in the air behind it. Sheriff Harlan Pike stepped out slowly, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. His expression carried a mixture of fatigue and guilt, a man burdened by the weight of both history and family. "I told you to leave it alone," Pike said quietly, his voice more weary than angry. Caleb rose to his feet, his hands still stained with the clay that covered his father. "You knew," he said, the words steady but cold. "You knew this was here." The sheriff didn't answer at first. His eyes drifted toward the open grave, the glint of the dog tag catching the light. He swallowed hard, the truth pressing against the walls of his composure. "My father and yours made a promise," he said at last. "A promise to protect this place no matter what. They said it was for honor, for peace, but it was really for silence, for shame." Caleb stepped closer, the exhaustion in his body replaced by something sharper. "Honor doesn't come from hiding men in the ground without names." Pike's jaw tightened. "You think I don't know that? My father spent the last years of his life wishing he'd told the truth. He tried to fix it, but by then, too many people had built their lives on the lie. The military wanted the numbers clean, the town wanted its heroes white, and my family wanted peace." His voice cracked slightly, the edges rough with memory. "And now you've stirred it all back up." Caleb looked back at the grave. "Maybe peace isn't what this town deserves." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Only the whisper of wind through the scorched crosses filled the space between them. The sheriff finally sighed, removing his hat and holding it at his side. "You going to report it?" "I'm going to do what he couldn't," Caleb said. "Tell the truth." Pike nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "Then I can't stop you." He turned back toward his car, pausing just once to look at the field. "Just know, Mercer, when you wake up the ghosts of this town, they don't go quietly." Caleb watched him leave, the sound of the engine fading down the road. The sun climbed higher, washing the field in pale gold. He took one last look at his father's remains before covering them gently with a tarp, a silent promise that this time the truth wouldn't be buried again. By late afternoon, he had gathered everything he could: the letter, the dog tags, the burned journal, and photographs from the archives. Each piece of evidence was a fragment of a buried history. He placed them in an old metal case, locked it, and loaded it into his truck. The drive to the courthouse was long and empty, the landscape rolling by in waves of red and brown. Every mile felt like crossing another boundary of fear, another layer of silence cracking open. Inside the courthouse, the clerk barely looked up when he entered. Caleb requested access to file a military report, his voice calm and deliberate. The paperwork felt endless, but with each line he signed, he reclaimed a piece of what had been stolen from his father. He left copies of the documents, photographs, and the letter with the county records office. For the first time, the name Henry Mercer would be written down in official ink, not as a ghost or a casualty, but as a man. That night, exhaustion settled deep in his bones. He returned to the farmhouse parked by the gate and stepped out into the cool darkness. The stars stretched endless above him, their silence too familiar. He walked to the gate, hand brushing the iron bars. The words, "Mercer Property," were still faintly visible beneath rust and time. Ranger trailed beside him, slower now, but watchful as always. Caleb sat on the porch steps, staring out across the field. The crosses stood in uneven rows, the burned ones reduced to shadows. He should have felt peace, but instead, unease prickled under his skin. The sheriff's warning echoed in his mind, threading through the night air. Ghosts don't go quietly. Sometime past midnight, a noise cut through the stillness. The low rumble of an engine, the crunch of tires on gravel. Caleb stood, his chest tightening. Lights flashed once, briefly, then disappeared. By the time he reached the gate, the truck was already gone. In its wake, the metallic scent of spray paint hung in the air. Across the entrance, scrawled in thick, dripping black letters, were the words that stung deeper than any threat: traitor. Caleb stood there under the moonlight, staring at the gate that marked his family's truth. Ranger pressed close to his leg, quiet but alert. The night wind moved through the crosses, whispering through the charred remains like voices remembering their name. Caleb's jaw set hard. He had unearthed the truth, and now the town had answered. Morning came heavy with tension. Red Clay had never felt this awake. The whispers that once traveled slowly between church pews and diner counters now roared through every cracked window and telephone line. The story was out, not through gossip, but through fact. Caleb's filed report had reached the courthouse clerk, and word had spread faster than fire. For the first time in decades, the town that prided itself on silence was being forced to remember. By noon, trucks lined the square outside the town hall. Men leaned against tailgates, arms crossed, faces carved with disbelief. Women stood in tight clusters, murmuring to each other as though truth were contagious. The sheriff's cruiser was parked near the steps, its driver's side door left open. Sheriff Harlan Pike stood there, not in command, but in quiet defeat. The weight of legacy hung off his shoulders like a uniform too heavy to wear. Caleb arrived with Ranger at his side, the letter in his hand, folded carefully but firm. He hadn't planned to speak that day, but something inside him refused to stay silent anymore. The courthouse steps felt colder than usual, the red dust kicked up by the crowd settling like fog. When the mayor tried to quiet everyone, it was Caleb's voice that broke through instead, calm, measured, and sharp as truth itself. "My father's name was Henry Mercer," he began. "You buried him in your soil, under someone else's name, and you told the world he never existed." The murmurs fell away like wind before a storm. His eyes swept over faces that had known his family for generations, faces that had looked away when they were driven out. "You called this place a memorial, but it's a cover-up. Every one of those crosses out there holds a man you erased because he didn't fit your version of honor." The words hung heavy. The sheriff stepped forward slightly, his expression unreadable, though his eyes told their own story, one of inherited guilt. "My father thought he was protecting something," Pike said quietly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He told me they couldn't let the world know what really happened overseas, that some of the bodies brought home weren't who they said they were. He was ordered to make it right, to keep the town proud. But pride isn't the same as truth." A ripple of discomfort moved through the crowd. One older man shouted from the back, his voice thick with resentment. "That's history, Mercer. You can't change what's done." Caleb turned toward him. "I'm not trying to change it," he said, his tone steady. "I'm trying to write it honestly, for the first time." The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was reckoning. An elderly woman, her hands trembling, stepped forward from the crowd. She held a faded photograph of two young men in uniform, one white, one black. "My brother fought with Henry," she said softly. "He told me once that the wrong man got buried under our name. I didn't believe him. I couldn't." Her voice cracked, but she held the picture higher. "You were right to come back, son. It's time people knew." The sheriff's head lowered. The weight of his father's sins had found its way home. "I spent my whole life defending this town," he murmured. "But maybe all I've done is protect a lie." Caleb approached him, the letter still clutched tightly. "Your father and mine wanted to protect something good," he said. "But good intentions don't excuse the truth buried under red clay." The sheriff didn't respond. His gaze drifted toward the horizon, where the field of crosses waited like a jury of ghosts. The crowd began to disperse slowly, the truth settling into the bones of red clay, like a long overdue storm. By late afternoon, the town had emptied again. Caleb returned to the field, exhausted but lighter somehow, until he noticed Ranger standing near the far edge, barking once, then again. The tone was different this time, sharper, urgent. Caleb followed, heart tightening with unease. The sun hung low, bleeding gold through the smoke-stained air, as Ranger pawed at a mound of freshly turned earth. The dirt was too clean, too smooth. Someone had been there recently. He dropped to his knees and began digging with his hands, the soil still damp. Ranger whined, circling him, the fur along his back bristling. A few inches down, Caleb's fingers struck something soft, a plastic cover, folded neatly, protecting an envelope. He pulled it free, brushing away the dirt. His name wasn't written on it, but the handwriting was familiar, firm, deliberate, the same hand that had signed official reports for decades, Sheriff Harlan Pike. He sat back on his heels, staring at the letter in silence. The sheriff had left town immediately after the gathering, his cruiser gone from its usual spot. Caleb's pulse quickened. He tore the envelope open carefully. Inside was a folded note and a small tarnished key. The note read, "I can't undo what my father did, but I can end the lie. The truth's not in the field. It's in what they locked away. Locker 47, County Depot, 1975. Unreported casualties. The rest is yours now." Caleb turned the key over in his hand. The numbers were engraved along the side, faint but clear. 1975, the year everything began. He looked toward the horizon, where the sun dipped behind the crosses, their shadows long and solemn across the red soil. The field that once held secrets now seemed to point him forward, toward something even larger than his father's story, a system built to hide men like him. Ranger pressed close against his leg, quiet but resolute. Caleb felt the cool metal of the key warm in his palm, the faintest tremor running through him. The locker, the records, the ghost, they were all waiting. As dusk deepened into night, he stood at the edge of the field one last time, looking back at the rows of crosses, some burned, some still whole, all whispering the same truth. The town's silence had broken, but what lay beyond this key could burn louder than fire. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, soft but certain. Caleb tightened his grip on the key. The past had given him its final clue. The morning was gray when Caleb arrived at the county depot. The sky pressed low, heavy with the weight of rain yet to fall. The old storage units stood in a long, forgotten row, their doors rusted and chained. Each one looked like a vault of secrets time had refused to claim. He held the small brass key the sheriff had left him, the engraving of 1975, unreported casualties, glinting faintly in the light. Ranger walked beside him, slower than before, his fur streaked with age and soot, his steps deliberate but loyal as ever. The key turned with a reluctant groan, the lock snapping open like the exhale of a truth too long contained. The door rolled upward with a scream of metal. Dust poured out like memory. Inside, the air was stale, thick with the scent of paper and time. A single shaft of light fell through a hole in the roof, striking the center of the room, where a series of wooden crates sat, stacked neatly, their lids marked with faded stencils. Confidential, 1975. Caleb approached the first one, his heart drumming. He pried the lid open, expecting files or paperwork, but what lay inside stopped his breath cold. Dog tags, hundreds of them, tangled together in dull silver chains, still carrying the weight of names that never found their way home. Each one belonged to a man who had served, fought, and vanished into the bureaucracy of war. He lifted a handful, letting them slide through his fingers, their metallic clinking filling the silence. Names shimmered faintly through the grime. Earl Simmons, James Coulter, Isaiah Webb, Nathan Carter, all black soldiers, all erased. Ranger whined softly, his nose nudging against the tags as if recognizing the souls behind them. Caleb swallowed hard, a strange calm overtaking his grief. His father's field had been more than a memorial. It had been a promise. And now, that promise demanded completion. He loaded the crates into his truck one by one, his movements steady but reverent, as though carrying caskets. The drive back to Red Clay felt different this time, not like returning to a place of pain, but arriving at a duty. The field awaited him beneath a dark sky, the crosses standing quietly against the horizon, some charred, some untouched, all part of the same truth. Caleb spent days working the land again, restoring what fire had taken. The townspeople who once avoided him now came in silence, bringing wood, tools, and hands willing to help. They didn't speak of the past. They worked in its shadow. Even Sheriff Pike returned one evening, his uniform replaced with a simple flannel shirt, the guilt in his eyes tempered by resolve. He said nothing, just picked up a hammer and began repairing one of the fallen crosses. Together, they built something beyond the town's history, a reckoning. Caleb carved each name he found from the crates onto the crosses, one by one, his hands blistered but steady. Every letter cut into the wood felt like restoring a breath that had been stolen. Some names he recognized from his father's journal, others from stories that had never been told. Each cross became a confession, each engraved name a resurrection. When the last of the names was done, the field had transformed. No longer a patch of forgotten earth. It was now a sea of white stretching against the red clay, each cross bearing the dignity of remembrance. The townspeople stood in quiet rows as Caleb raised the final one. A new plaque hung by the gate, Mercer Memorial Field, in honor of those who served without recognition. As the sun set, painting the sky in copper and rose, Ranger lay near Caleb's feet, his breathing slow and shallow. The dog's muzzle had gone gray, his strength fading after years of loyal watch. Caleb knelt beside him, resting his hand gently on his side. "You found him for me," he whispered, his voice breaking with gratitude. "You never stopped." Ranger's eyes lifted once, meeting his with the kind of understanding that words could never touch. When his breathing finally stilled, Caleb didn't cry. He simply stayed there, hand on his companion's fur, as the night deepened around them. The next morning, he buried Ranger beside the final cross, the one that bore his own name. He carved it himself, Caleb Mercer, Jr., and beneath it, he added another line in smaller letters, Faithful Friend, Ranger. The gesture felt right. This field had become a story of loyalty and truth, and Ranger had been both. Weeks later, the government inquiry arrived. Officials came with clipboards and cautious words, trying to piece together what had been hidden for decades. Caleb gave them everything: the documents, the tags, the letter. When they offered him compensation or media attention, he refused. "Just make their names official," he said. "That's all I want." And eventually they did. The Mercer Field was registered as a national memorial site. The names that once lay buried in silence were entered into record, their service acknowledged at last. Life in red clay began to shift slowly. The diner walls, once decorated with selective history, now displayed photographs of all the soldiers, white and black, who had come from the town. The same people who once crossed the street to avoid Caleb now greeted him with quiet nods of respect. The sheriff, aged beyond his years, became the field's caretaker after retiring, ensuring the crosses were repainted each spring. Caleb stayed on the land, not as a recluse, but as its keeper. He built a small cabin near the edge of the field and spent his days tending to the crosses, writing the full account of what had happened. It wasn't a story of revenge. It was one of reconciliation. He finally understood what his father had meant when he said that peace could only be built on truth. One afternoon, as a storm gathered on the horizon, Caleb stood before the last cross. The sky above turned dark gray, wind bending the grass into ripples. He traced his fingers over the wood, feeling the carved letters, Mercer Sr. and Mercer Jr. The two names shared one cross now, united in the soil that had once divided them. Thunder rolled softly, the rain beginning to fall, and just as the first lightning cracked in the distance, a ray of sunlight broke through, a single beam cutting across the dark clouds, landing directly on the final cross. The field shimmered in its glow, each drop of rain catching the light like falling glass. Caleb closed his eyes and let the rain wash over him. There was no bitterness left, no anger, only the quiet certainty that truth had finally been spoken. The land that had once buried his family's name now bore it proudly. The field of crosses had become something living, not a graveyard, but a promise kept. If stories like this one remind you that truth can survive even when history tries to bury it, don't let it stay silent again. Share this story, keep their names alive, and be part of the voice that honors the forgotten. Before you go, tell me this: if your family's truth was buried to protect someone else's pride, would you dig it up or let it rest?